Welcome back, everybody, to the Child Repair Guide. I'm Dr. Steve Silvestro, and my guest today is Dr. Andrea Bonior, clinical psychologist, author of multiple books, and frequent guest of programs such as CNN, The Today Show, Good Morning America, and more, including the Child Repair Guide. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Bonior.
Thanks so much for having me back.
Yeah, so you were one of the very first guests interviewed for this podcast over 4 years ago. And in the time since then, we have had the Washington Nationals win the World Series.
Yes, that's true.
You have published 2 more books, and we've had a crippling global pandemic. So it's been a busy 4 years.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I like 2 of those things more than the third, I'll tell you that. But it has been an incredibly strange and wild 4 years. I can't believe it's been that long.
Yeah, it has. And I should say right off the bat that your latest book is Detox Your Thoughts, Quit Negative Self-Talk for Good, and Discover the Life You've Always Wanted. And that you also have a LinkedIn learning course on the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And I'll have that linked up for folks in the show notes. And this book is excellent. Both my wife and I have read it, and you may or may not be able to see it in the video, but we've got a handful of pages dog-eared throughout the book, which is always a mark of a good book in this house.
Oh, well, I appreciate that so much. And I appreciate the support. You know, as your listeners may not know, your wife is one of my very dearest friends. And so she's been a wonderful part of even the writing process, cheerleading me on, which I've been so grateful for.
And it's been an interesting time, I think, for a lot of folks who have come out with really great material right now, because, you know, your launch of the book was thwarted by the pandemic. I know a handful of folks who've come out with books where the marketing and release has really been impacted, but you know, it's also really impacted everybody, every single person, parent or otherwise. You know, to say that the last few months have been stressful would be an understatement, especially for parents, because they have taken on the roles of teleworker, homeschooler, family health expert, nuclear decontamination projects. We're all feeling the challenges here. And so I think that it's probably important for us to start off by saying to everyone who is listening or watching that you are not alone if you are feeling stressed and challenged right now.
Yes, I think that is so important. I mean, when you really think about the reality of the day-to-day disruption that we've been going through really since early March for most of us in the United States, it's uncanny how much we've actually been asked to take on, how much we've been asked to go without. I mean, if someone had told most parents a year ago, oh, by the way, you know, the last several months of your children's school years are going to exist totally in your own home, and you're not going to be able to visit your extended family. And every time you go to the grocery store, you'll wonder if maybe you're putting yourself at risk for death. And by the way, you're still going to have to do your job, probably from home, if you have a job, because there's a good chance you'll lose your job. I mean, we would have said, no, I'm crying uncle. This doesn't sound like something I want to sign up for. And I think it's been this situation where a lot of us are just trying to get by day after day after day, and we haven't had the opportunity to remind ourselves, this is unreal. This is extremely stressful. This is a chronically stressful situation because we wake up and do the whole thing all over again. And I think it's not even just a matter of giving ourselves a pat on the back, but it's also a matter of recognizing that this stress does have negative effects, and we can't hide from those. And we need to acknowledge those and support each other in those, because if we pretend like we should be doing everything perfectly and not getting irritable and not, you know, feeling our best, or you know, not having problems, I think it's going to be hard for us to actually have some compassion to ourselves and to each other. And that's going to make it more difficult for us to climb out of this and cope.
Yeah. And you touched on what is probably a really good starting point, which is that when we talk about stress, we talk about acute stress and chronic stress and how they have different impacts on our bodies and our well-being. And this is a chronic stress right now. You know, we were all really hoping that this might be a month or maybe 2 months, but there are question marks about how far into the future this is all going to last. And so this is something that we need to figure out how to manage. Can you talk about acute and chronic stress and what might be going on for most people right now, whether physiologically or mentally, and how that's an impact?
Yeah, it has so many effects on the body that I think a lot of people don't even realize. So with acute stress, we go through that fight or flight, oh my goodness, there's a scary doctor's appointment that I'm worried about. It comes up, all hopefully is fine, and our systems go back to normal. We get out of the stress response because the threat is gone. Or, oh my goodness, I'm going to have a performance review at work and I'm worried about it for a week. It actually goes okay. I keep my job. My system resets and I go back to normal. And when I say my system, we're talking about all kinds of stress response systems within the body that affect your autonomic nervous system. So everything from the way that your thoughts happen to your muscle and your heart rate and your immune system and all these things. So with chronic stress, the threat is ever present and our bodies can reach a state of exhaustion because we're not being able to reset. And I think that's what's so difficult about this pandemic in particular is that everybody keeps saying this is a marathon, not a sprint, but nobody knows when the marathon ends. I mean, I would never run it. Well, I would never run many races anyway, because that's not my bag, but I would never run a race where they said, by the way, you just have to keep running. And at some point, maybe we'll create a finish line for you, but we really can't tell you when or where. But that's what we're doing. And that's the chronic stress response. And because our bodies can't reset because there is no finish line yet, it really has some negative effects. It takes away aspects of our memory. It disrupts our sleep. It raises our cortisol levels sort of on a daily basis. And what's scary from an emotional and mental perspective is that it makes it harder to climb out of negative thinking because our neurons actually don't regenerate as quickly, right? So we get stuck in these same pathways because we're not able to actually grow new neurons at quite the same rate. So we're stuck in the same negative thinking, which can lead to all kinds of catastrophizing and hopelessness and learned helplessness. So the chronic stress response, it's also not great for the body. I mean, that's the horrible irony of all of this, is that we're actually depleting our immune systems a little bit when we're lonely and when we're stressed, which are totally natural reactions to this. I mean, our social lives, that's actually pretty good for our immune system. It's pretty good for our health. But now, because we've had to go without that, we're in worse shape. And so I think that's why it's important that we really stress all the basic self-care stuff that we know we should do. And yet it's very easy to put that aside. Yeah. I know I should get sleep, but my kids are staying up so late that the only time to actually have a quiet house is, at midnight. And so now I'm up at midnight and, I know I should eat well, but I can not even go to the grocery store as easily as before. So we're just going to get a lot of takeout and frozen food that, doesn't make me feel great. So it's these things have become so hard. And I think we do have to try to prioritize as much as possible the things that are good for us. Same thing with outdoor time. I mean, we know fresh air and sunlight is very good emotionally too. And yet we need to be able to do that in a safe way because it's not as easy as it was before. Or absolutely socializing, same thing. It's so hard now to get that truly emotionally nourishing social contact since we have to be so careful. But we still have to prioritize it because I think people don't always realize that it is actually a matter of physical health as well. The stress response, the less that we try to counteract that and manage that in healthy ways, the worse it is for our immune system.
That's right. And I want to get to some practical ways that people can prioritize that in a little bit, because I recognize as somebody who talks about the same thing often, that it's often very easy to talk about these things, and we all know that we should be doing this and hard to really actually put it into play. But I wanted to step back for a moment and look at some more of that emotional picture that we all may be feeling. I sort of half joked a moment ago about all the different roles that everybody is playing. Mm-hmm. And as you touched on, because we are feeling this chronic stress, we're depleted. And so it's often very hard to feel that we are really doing a good job in any of these roles. Mm-hmm. How can parents manage this identity crisis of feeling like you're neither up to par in your professional tasks and not really the parent that you want to be for your kids at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is a matter of lowering expectations at some point. And we have such problems doing this, but I think we can lower our expectations in a way that actually keeps in mind the meaning of this time. So for instance, there are a lot of things that we can model for our kids in positive ways, even when we feel like we're sort of falling down on the job. Like, I think it's a matter of thinking about your values. Like, okay, I slipped up and didn't, stay on top of my kid on their math work, and they missed a bunch of Zooms because our Wi-Fi was screwed up. And I wasn't on top of that because I was supposed to fix that, but I forgot because I was in a work meeting. And oh no, I've been a horrible parent because my kid missed math for a week and now the teacher's calling me, right? Okay, you feel like a horrible parent there, but it's a matter of loosening that standard, because the meaning of this time is also to model for your child how to deal with difficult things. And oh my goodness, we screwed up. How do we handle that? And we have to be flexible. It turns out that we can't do absolutely everything all day, every day that we're supposed to, because we're in the middle of a crisis here. How can we empathize with each other? How can I apologize for the fact that I screwed up and didn't fix the Wi-Fi like I said I would? How can I communicate? How can I resolve this conflict? How can we work it out with your teacher, how to make up this work? Those are all wonderful, wonderful parenting moments. They don't look like we think they're supposed to look like because we say, oh, we screwed up. But if you think about lowering the expectation of, perfection with school or whatever, and instead say, well, my kid learned something else in the process, and that's how to climb back out of an embarrassing situation where they didn't show up for class and now their teacher's calling, right? That's also important. So sometimes lowering expectations, people say, oh, I don't want to lower expectations. I want to do my best, but it's a matter of thinking about different expectations. And I heard, a fellow psychologist put it this way, like, part of our goals during this time should be to keep a functional relationship with our families that we're living with all the time and not getting an escape from, and to not get fired. Right?
Yeah,
like,
sounds good.
It really can be that simple at some point. And then you can build in your own values. I had these moments when the school year was still going on of, oh my gosh, I have 3 children. We're dropping all these balls. Oh no, shoot, she didn't have this. And then I was like, okay, well, you know what? My daughter learned how to cut hair. And granted, her teenage brother, was grateful that he didn't actually have to go into school after the results. But like, hey, that was something I wouldn't have expected and was kind of cool. Okay, we're doing more baking, or they're learning about the Titanic, or, these random things. I think we need to remember these still can be aligned with our parenting values, even if we're kind of screwing up in other ways. And in terms of the work thing, really, sometimes it is about recognizing that you're not at your best professionally. Nobody's at their best professionally. And if you can hang on to your job, some days that's enough. Some days it's enough to not get fired and to not cause harm to other people. It's really that basic. And the next day you might try to do better, but you're doing okay if that's your standard, because that's enough. Some days this is enough. If you think about the fact that we are being asked to fill all these roles all day, every day, when in reality, in the past, we used to be able to have more attention to each role and sort of finesse it better. There's no magic time capsule that's giving us double the amount of time or double the amount of mental attention or double the amount of resources. We're asked to do so much more with so much less. So something has got to give, and that's okay.
One thing that I appreciate in this time is that, and I hope maybe we sort of expand on and remember when this time passes, is an acceptance of imperfection. Watching the late night hosts record from their homes and all their guests who used to look prim and proper and have makeup and hair done, and they're slightly disheveled. Now everyone's looking a little bit better because they've had a few months to really prep and get their backgrounds ready and the lighting set up. But we've all gotten used to seeing Zooms of colleagues and people we looked up to that are not really exactly on point.
Yeah.
You're not gonna be able to see, but I'll show on the camera for everyone who might be watching on YouTube and Facebook and elsewhere. So this is a background right now, but over here we've got mess and guitars and more stuff all over the place here. And I think that kind of resetting of priorities, now people watching are watching me finagle with the camera to get it straight again. I think that hopefully is going to have a little bit more of a cultural impact afterwards, that we sort of rebalance what we think is important.
Yeah.
It's just kind of hard to maybe figure that out right now.
Yeah. I love that, because I think in the imperfection is humanity, really, and vulnerability. And I do think we live in an age where we're so used to curating everything, as much as that word grates on me, but here's my perfectly calculated social media post.
Yeah.
Now it's like, oops, my kid just ran in, during a Zoom call. Sorry about that. Like, okay, but that's also part of being human. I've worked with some people who say that they actually feel a little bit more like they know their coworkers. I mean, I think most people are feeling detached. It's very hard to, not be around people physically. But I've worked with some who say, you know what, though, there's something about sort of seeing that previously perfect seeming coworker actually kind of get real and be like, you know what, like, here's what's going on in my house, because you see it in the background, and my cat is making a nuisance of themselves. Like, there's actually some room for connection there, because it's vulnerability. I think we're so used to not being vulnerable, and we're so used to wanting to make sure that we put out the equivalent of press releases about ourselves when we post on social media or whatever. And now it's like, we've lost a little bit of control, and we've had to be vulnerable. But if you look at human relationships, it's vulnerability that actually can help people truly develop intimacy and connection. And that can be wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's talk about some of that vulnerability and leading into that. I asked a few people if they had anything they'd like me to ask you, and some of the common threads were some of the guilt that is coming up with not meeting their expectations. One person said that it was curious about what long-term impact they'd be having on their kids by essentially being visibly stressed and overwhelmed so much, and not being able to spend as much time with them. In your book, you talk about leaning into uncomfortable feelings. Can you touch on that? Maybe even answering, how much of an impact do we think kids will feel by seeing us stressed?
Yeah.
And, I'll often sort of try and assuage folks and say it's not a forever thing. There's always room to fix that. But, with that guilt and all these other uncomfortable feelings, how can parents feel okay with leaning into those feelings, accepting them, and then moving forward?
Yeah, it's a big quandary. But I think a key thing to ask yourself is, what am I showing as a method of handling this stress? How am I teaching my kids to learn something from these feelings? So there's a huge difference to me between a parent who's chronically stressed, chronically barking at their kids, chronically sort of just, saying, well, this is the way things are, and, we're all stressed, versus a parent who's chronically stressed and they're occasionally barking at their kids, but they're trying to talk to their kids about what's happening. And they're sitting down with their kids and they're saying, this is difficult, and I'm sorry that I snapped at you. And I felt overwhelmed because I had a deadline with my boss that I knew I wasn't going to be able to make, but I shouldn't have taken that out on you. When I feel overwhelmed, I lose my patience and I speak too quickly and I don't pause before I say something, and I'm going to try to do better about that. And here's what I'm going to do. The next time I feel overwhelmed, you might see me about to say something, but instead I'm going to put myself in a 5-second timeout. So if you see me sort of look down and say, hold on, it's because I'm waiting. What do you do when you're stressed? How do you feel when you're overwhelmed? How did it feel when I snapped at you? I'm sorry for that, but I want to know how it affected you. I mean, that's night and day, right? Yeah. So the goal should never be perfection, because what is perfection going to teach our kids? Perfection, if we're trying to model that, is going to teach them that when they screw up, there's no hope because they've already messed up. Whereas instead, if we can model, things are tough, things are imperfect, here's what I'm working on. How do you want to work on it? I think that can actually be such growth for them. I mean, for some families that I've talked to and some clients I've had, the goal has been to even work on it as a family, each week to say, hey, here's what I'm working on this week. Last week, I don't feel like I was patient enough with you. I didn't pause before answering a question. This week, I'm going to work on pausing when I'm feeling impatient. Do you want to make a goal for this week? How do you want to work on it? Because I think leaning into those feelings is so good for our kids to see. Because I think so many of us grow up in households where you just don't talk about the feelings. You just don't. And you're sort of expected to figure it out. The interesting thing about labeling feelings is that the research is very clear that it helps us manage them. It feels more powerful. It empowers us to actually have a word to be able to talk about. And it's no secret. That's a little bit of why therapy is so helpful, is because it creates the forum to be able to say, I'm sad. And to have somebody else say, that sucks. And let's talk about what feeling sad is, rather than like, get over it. So it's empowering for our kids. You don't want to be perfect for them. That's not the goal. But when there's communication, when there's empathy, when there's a reality check, when you model for them that you're trying to do better and you try to teach them tools and they see you actually working on those tools, that is night and day. That is where the real growth comes from. And honestly, I truly believe that you're giving your kids a gift when you do that, and yourself too, because they get to learn something. Whereas kids who grew up in houses where, the parent was stressed, but they didn't acknowledge being stressed, or you were just supposed to buck up and deal with it, they couldn't learn as well how to manage their own feelings. And I do think it's a way of growing closer to your kids too, by saying, hey, I'm kind of struggling here, but here's what I'm doing to try to get better about it.
I think it's also helpful because it shows that there is a continuum in how well we all can manage the challenges that we face.
Mm-hmm.
And that, hopefully you're always sort of bending towards getting better, but that it shows that even when you are trying to work on it, it doesn't mean that you have to be perfect right off the bat. I had a teacher, maybe in high school, I suppose, that said something not about me, thankfully, but it's always stuck with me, which was that saying you're sorry means that you'll never do it again. And it actually took me a long time to kind of not really feel that's entirely true, because that's sort of a goal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we have to understand that whether you're apologizing to maybe what you did with your kids, or just recognizing some other mark that you didn't quite hit.
Yes.
I think that it's important to know that just because you are working on it doesn't mean that you have to therefore be successful right off the bat at doing it.
Yes, that's so key, because we're all works in progress. And unfortunately, if we assume that we're not allowed to make another mistake, then we're prone to giving up. Why bother? I've already screwed up. I mean, of course, that's what we see with sort of crash diets and all that stuff all the time, is like, I've created this unrealistic standard. I haven't met it. And so therefore, everything's out the window. I'm just going to not even bother, because what's the point, right? That's the opposite of progress.
So I like to dig into some specific tools that folks can use. One that I think, especially in this topic of parenting and working and handling everything all at the same time right now, is boundary setting. It's something that gets talked about a lot, but has been very hard for many people to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do you suggest parents set boundaries right now? And what sort of boundaries do you think make the most sense to focus on?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I mean, it's such an important topic. And there are really different kinds of boundaries, as I see it, that are important. For a parent trying to work from home when there are kids from home, first of all, the physical boundaries are really, really important. Even if you have to be in the same room as your child, it's really important to try to create some sort of physical marker of I'm working, because it serves as a signal to your kid. And it also puts you in the work mindset. I think, most of us hate commutes, right? Commutes are much maligned for a good reason. But one thing that a commute does provide is the physical boundary of the symbol of, okay, I'm going to work. I'm in a workspace right now. Yeah. And you have that buffer of being in the metro or in the car or walking or whatever. So what I recommend to help create further that physical boundary is to say, okay, I'm going to take a 10-minute walk before my workday starts each day, because I need to sort of clear in my mind that I'm on this, new front. I'm on the work front. And it's also helpful for your kids because they see, okay, the laptop's out. He's got his, his little file folders there. The work lamp is on. Dad's working, mom's working, whatever it might be. The physical boundary, maybe you never used sort of headphones or anything at work because you had a quiet space. Now, maybe you say, okay, I'm going to listen to music a little bit. I'm going to create some sort of physical space. And your kid can have that too. If they're working schoolwork, same thing. We actually really benefit from having that clarity of work mode versus home mode, which of course that boundary is being bulldozed during this time, but we can still try to create it a little bit. And the logistical boundaries are really important in that sense too, in terms of, okay, I am going to close the laptop at 6. And I'm going to be clear with my kids that, you will get me at 6:30, or I will play catch with you at 6:30. Their kids are going to be much less likely to interrupt when they know there's a known quantity. It doesn't even matter how much time, as much as that they can trust that time, because the kids are going to be interrupting the most and the most needy when it's unclear. Like, well, I don't know. They've been on a call. Mom's been on a call all day. And when are they going to pay attention to me? If at the beginning of the day you say, okay, today we can have lunch together at 1, you will see me then, and I will listen to everything then, but I really have an important call at 11 that you can't interrupt. Obviously it's going to depend on the age of the kid. But one thing, you can even build some flexibility into these boundaries. Most people think, okay, boundaries are strict and verboten and, you can build flexibility into boundaries. Like one system I really like that we've kind of used a version of is sort of red light, yellow light, green light, right? So my husband and I have both been working from home fully, since March. Our kids, all 3 of them, have all been at home since March. And so what we kind of do is, for me, there's an element. I mean, my husband, it's like, he has a lot of calls and stuff, but it's not the end of the world if he gets interrupted. Whereas for me, some of the things I do, like, recording a podcast or going on live national television or teaching my students or doing therapy, it's really important that the kids don't interrupt. So those are like red light situations. It's spelled out in advance. There's a level of quiet they have to have if I'm on CNN or if I'm on a call where a therapy call, that it's a red light. Like if you were to interrupt me, I'm expecting a severed picture.
A missing limb. That's right.
Right? And that works really well because it's a known system and they know when it starts and they know when it ends. They can unbelievably keep quiet if it's a finite amount of time. Now, they might prove me wrong. We might be about to hear them screaming upstairs. Who knows? But in general, when it's a finite amount of time, kids respond to that because they know when it ends. All right, I can just, be quiet for a little while. Yellow light would mean, what? I'm probably working on a writing project. I do want to plow through and I don't want to be interrupted. But, if you make noise, it's okay. If you absolutely need to know where that weird part of the blender is that you can never find and you always have to ask me, yes, you can come and ask, but please do let me work if you can. Whereas green light is like, if you need something, don't bother going to Dad. You can come to me. It's okay. I'm trying to wrap up some emails and stuff, but I'm probably about to have lunch or end the day. So come on in if you want to chat, right? So that's a boundary, but there's flexibility within the boundary because they know there are gradations of it. And it gives them a sense of control, right? Because kids should feel part of this process. I think sometimes we expect well, just let me work. Okay, well, what does that mean? How long does that go on? How quiet do I have to be? Or we say, don't make noise. just don't bother me, right? But that's not telling them what to do. So another way of sort of getting the boundary to stick is to say, okay, this is puzzle time. You have to have quiet puzzle time in your room during this time. It's not just don't make noise. It's I'm doing a therapy call, and if my client hears a screaming kid in the background, that's going to be clinically bad. So you've got to keep it down. Here's a puzzle. Here's your workbook you're going to do, or you're going to go outside and stay away from the window or whatever. So building those boundaries in, I think, is really, really important. And then finally, there's just the emotional boundary of thinking about how much am I going to allow work to intrude on my life, and how much am I going to allow my kids to intrude upon my work? Like, none of these boundaries mean anything if you don't buy into it. So some of setting the emotional boundaries might involve talking to your boss and saying, here is my situation. After 7 each night, I really need to not be expected to answer emails. And maybe normally I could, but right now, during this pandemic, when I'm constantly sort of balancing work and life and kids and everything, I do need to have a set time where I'm not on my phone, period. So maybe it involves that. Because I think a lot of times we feel guilty for enacting the boundaries, so we don't enact them at all. And we're like, oh, yes, I have this boundary, but or maybe we're the person that sort of wants to delegate everything, and we don't actually want to sort of let other people do what we think we should be doing. And so now we're just doing everything all the time, and we're always the one loading the dishwasher, and we're also the one running the work call that somebody else has said that they can run for us if we need it, and yet we're doing it anyway. And so now we've obliterated our own boundaries because we're taking on too much. So that emotional buy-in is really important too.
What role do you think employers should play? I mean, it's one task just to get all of us to try and learn some flexibility and reset or change our mindset with this. But, obviously employers need to as well. Do you have any thoughts on what needs to happen sort of institutionally there?
Yeah. I mean, in my ideal world, all employers would be talking about this to the point where there was a groundswell of a complete redefining of work-life balance, for families, because I think this has long been a problem. We know that gender roles, we know that socioeconomic status, we know that race and ethnicity play a role in terms of making it a lot harder for certain segments of the population to really be able to truly work and not run afoul of problems with childcare, right? We make it really hard on working parents in this country. We make it especially hard on working parents of color and on single mothers. And and so I think in my ideal world, all the employers would be talking about this. Like, we need full human beings to work, and full human beings actually have lives and they have responsibilities. But I think on an individual level, if I were sort of a manager of a team, I would want to truly just have real conversations that aren't the status quo, that aren't pretending that everything is fine, and saying, what do you think you need to do your best work, and how can I support that? Because the truth is, employers are going to get more productivity out of their employees if they actually pay attention to this stuff. I've done a lot of keynotes where I really emphasize the data that we think that work-life balance, we think that self-care takes away from employers' work productivity and efficiency. The opposite is true. They're better workers. They do better work in a smaller amount of time when they're not super stressed about balancing other things. They're more efficient. And so, I think for so long, employers have sort of assumed that all this loosey-goosey emotional wellness stuff or paying attention to an employee's needs with their family is like, that means they're not going to be doing as good of work for me, or they're not going to be working as many hours. No, you'll get a better worker that way if you actually make it so that they can do their work without the stress response being so overwhelming. Stressed workers don't do good work. They're scattered. They're not mentally there. So a real conversation where an employer is not afraid to say, okay, maybe I won't be able to email you at 8 at night and expect a response anymore. But you know what? I'll probably get more clear, thoughtful, creative responses the next morning because of it.
That's right. So the boundaries really need to be set on both ends. We've got to work on our own home boundaries and emotional boundaries. But yeah, the data really does show, some of the initial stuff on teleworking pre-pandemic. everyone was afraid that, oh, you're going to work from home, you're going to watch TV and not get anything done. When a lot of the data really showed that people were more efficient, which is kind of funny because it shows how much time is wasted working 9 to 5 or longer, right? 5 days a week plus for some people in an office. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. Recognizing that if we can meet an individual's needs, then everybody benefits on all ends.
Yeah. And may I also add quickly that involves practicing what you preach, because I think of a lot of employers are good with sort of saying, okay, yeah, work-life balance. Yeah, sure. Take the time you need. Oh yeah. Okay. And they're not practicing it themselves. And employees note that, because that's what creates the culture within a work environment. And when you create a norm from the top down where you're not going to actually practice what you preach, then it's very hard for employees to actually, stick their necks out and say, but no, you said it was okay. We need to do this and set boundaries, right?
Yeah. I mean, we come out and heard all these headlines in the last few years of companies that had the foosball table and the ping pong table and the couches everywhere, and it turned out they had very toxic environments. So yeah.
Yes, or I'm going to bring in a yoga class for my employees, while meanwhile I'm doing these 15 things that make it a completely dysfunctional work environment. And as I always joke with some of my talks, like, that just means that your employees are just, they're miserable while doing downward dog. Like, you haven't changed the fact that they're still miserable.
Yeah. Well, so let's tackle that misery. In your book, you talk about a whole host of exercises and tools that people can use to help with chronic stress, and also to help with reframing their mindset, which clearly is sort of running through all these things that we're talking about today. Do you, just an open question, do you have any favorite techniques, or any that you think that if someone were to pick one or two of all the things you might recommend, what would you say might be the most important for the widest number of people who might be listening or watching right now?
Yeah, sure. If I had to think about that, I think the first step is really important. That's sort of within chapter 1 of the book, which is learning to view your negative thoughts as a gentle observer. So this goes along with mindfulness, which of course I know that you are a big proponent of. It's a different way of relating to our thoughts. So many of us hear our negative thoughts as just this part of us that is true. Oh, I screwed up. Oh, so-and-so is mad at me. Oh, the results are going to be bad. And we don't actually label that as just a thought. So part of what the book really gets into from the get-go is a component of acceptance and commitment therapy and mindfulness, which is, let's label our thoughts as if we were an observer. Let's learn to watch the thoughts. And it starts as simple as labeling it as a thought, as in, I literally mean, I'm having the thought that I screwed up. I'm having the thought that the results are going to be bad. I'm having the thought. And that gives us an important distance. And some of us can take it even further. Actually, it sounds hokey, but by labeling it as if we are truly an observer, like in the third person. Andrea's having the thought that she's going to blow this interview. Andrea's having the thought that her life's never going to be the same and that this pandemic's never going to go away. Andrea's having the thought that her boss is mad at her after that email was sent. Because what that initially does is it helps us learn to recognize a thought as something that's neither inherently part of us nor inherently true. Now, some negative thoughts are true, and that's when you can learn to ask, okay, is this thought teaching me anything? Is it helping me develop a plan and insight? Is it helping me grow? Or am I just having the same true ruminating thought over and over again where I'm just beating myself up? Then I can learn to let it go. But that's sort of this first important step. And then the entire book kind of builds on that, because what we can do once we can sort of be an observer, a gentle, non-judgmental and curious observer of our thoughts, is then we can learn to let the negative ones that aren't helping us pass. Because I think a key thing that a lot of people don't realize is that negative thoughts alone do not cause depression and anxiety. All of us have negative thoughts at some point. What really causes depression and anxiety, and what perpetuates a super stressful state of mind, is when negative thoughts become sticky. So the precise way to not let them stick is that first step of learning to look at them as an observer and to realize that they can pass on their own. And there are all kinds of techniques to help them pass. Some of them are quite fun. I have clients that, they visualize their negative thought as a dark blob, or, oh, here's my worry cloud, or here's my nervous Nelly voice, or, here's Mr. Bossy coming in and telling me that I should have done it differently. All of those things we can sort of do individually. No two people are alike, but the more that you can sort of detach from your thoughts and view them as an observer, then you can give them names, you can watch them pass, you can get your body involved by breathing through them and feeling them leave your body because they were in your chest and now they're somewhere else. So yeah, I think that's such a key component, because I think a lot of us are led to believe when we're growing up that our thoughts define us. I mean, this is the classic American spirit, right? If you think it, then it will happen. Just visualize this great outcome and it'll help happen. We are what we believe. And it's like, okay, actually, that's done a lot of damage. Because some thoughts are random and arbitrary and negative, and we don't have to listen to them. And when we tell ourselves, oh, I just didn't think positively enough, well, negative thoughts are a fact of life. We shouldn't be avoiding them. We shouldn't be telling ourselves that we need to just insert a positive thought, because we give negative thoughts power when we say, oh, can't think that way. Scary, scary, scary. Here's the thing. If you try not to think a certain way, you think a certain way. I mean, we know this from cognitive research. The classic case, I always say, like, try not to picture a chimpanzee in a sundress drinking a margarita, right? I mean, for most of us,
Thanks.
See, I know, right? For
there it is.
Us, there she is, right? We can't tell ourselves not to think negatively, because we do think negatively sometimes, and that's okay. The key is learning to disempower those thoughts and to keep them from sticking. That is where the magic happens, and where it keeps us from becoming chronically anxious and stressed and depressed.
Yeah. And I think that for those who maybe have not dug into this or thought about this idea much, the idea of leaving your thoughts or detaching your thoughts can seem hokey or foreign, because, like you said, we are ingrained with this feeling that our thoughts, we are our thoughts. They are part of us. Mm-hmm. I think that for me personally, I began this journey with mindfulness because I had the really lucky confluence of events my first year in college. Mm-hmm. We had to take a required theology course. I learned about Buddhism and Taoism that way, at the same time that I had a biology professor who made a really interesting remark one day, where he said, we were learning about neurons and how electrical signals move through neurons with basically just sodium and potassium going in and out of cells. Mm-hmm. And he went through all of this. And at the end, he said, so I want you to go home with the realization that every single thought that you have is nothing but sodium and potassium moving in and out of the cell. That's what it actually is. Mm-hmm. And so when you really kind of step back and say this thought, this human feeling, this big cognitive sort of thing that I'm feeling and thinking right now, in the end, is just sodium and potassium moving in and out of a part of my body.
Yes.
In a way, I mean, it does actually become a lot easier to say, well, yeah, maybe that thought was just a reflex, yeah, or was just an accident, or is something that is transient and not permanent.
Yes. I love that. I mean, isn't that remarkable? And I think some listeners might be saying, but well, then where's the meaning in any of this? And who am I really? And what's to differentiate me from the person next to me, right? But I think that's when all the important work of finding your values comes in, and finding what thoughts you do want to let stick, and how you do want to define your life, and who you do want to be, because then you actually have the freedom to choose which thoughts matter, rather than being bogged down by, these electrical impulses in your brain that are telling you thoughts that, really it's just better for you to let go of.
Yeah. Yes, we got a little deep right there.
I know. I feel like I should be burning a candle somewhere or something.
I think that, to just sort of bring back to the communal aspect of what's happening right now, I think a lot of us can probably take some solace in knowing that we are all going through these same stresses and challenges right now, whether it is working from home with the kids around or losing a job or having financial hardship. These things are touching on so many people, if not to say almost everybody. How can we benefit from the communal nature of this and knowing that we're not alone? Maybe while also at the same time not necessarily just going onto social media and griping and sort of, there's some benefit there, I imagine. There's probably some benefit also in having sort of a group vent fest online. But how do we walk the line of not allowing each other to feed into the negativity of what's happening, while at the same time accepting that negativity as something that we're all facing?
Right. Yeah. I think it's a hard balance to strike for sure. And there's such a fine line between, oh, it's helpful for us to all vent and moan for a while versus, oh, now we actually feel worse and we've just ruminated. And I think a key difference there that matters is hope. Can we help bring each other hope in this? And can we empathize in such a way that says, this is really hard. I'm feeling it too. I'm sorry you're going through that. Here's what I'm going through as well that might make you laugh or, might make you realize you're not alone. But also there is a light at the end of this tunnel. There's a difference between that versus, oh my God, and this is never going to get better. And, everything is hopeless and just here's how bad it is for someone else. And I think what we can provide to each other is a little bit of light in the darkness with the fact that we do know on some level, we will come out of this. And again, it's excruciating because we don't know when, but I think we can help remind each other of that. And I think it's very important that when we reach out to each other, we remember that the human spirit benefits from other people listening and just being there in the space. Of course, it might not even be physical space because you're doing it online or over the phone or whatever, but there is such power in just bearing witness to someone else's feelings. And so sometimes just listening, I think so many times we think, oh, I've got to say the right thing. Oh, I didn't help at all. Oh, I didn't give her the right advice. And it's like, there's power in just bearing witness to somebody else's feelings. And just, again, that's another thing that the therapy is helpful for, just to before you even get into the actual techniques, just having another human being who cares and sits in the room and bears witness to your pain. That's the role we can provide for people. But I think, again, as you mentioned, being able to do it in such a way that reminds us that there is hope in this too. And that there is light in this too. And there are little moments of beauty. Like maybe, if I'm having a Zoom call with 5 of my college friends and we're all, moaning and scared about, the political environment too and all of this, maybe we'll reserve the last 15 minutes to say something funny or something surprising or just a little moment of beauty, however small it was, that came in our day, to end on that note. And striking that balance in that way, I think is important. It's hard though, and sometimes we just need to be able to vent. I mean, I think we've all had those calls sometimes where then it's like the next day you're like, hey, yeah, thanks for listening. I was not at my best.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because that's part of connecting. But hope is so important. I did my dissertation on hope, in fact, and I think it's so key. And there are going to be moments of feeling hopeless for sure. And we don't want to ignore those moments or tell ourselves that we're bad for not feeling hope. But if we can just find a little bit of hope, I think oftentimes that's what can keep us going.
Yeah. And, we can probably keep going for a long time, but I think that's actually probably the perfect place for us to wrap up, is on a message of hope.
Yes.
So Dr. Andrea Bonior, once again, her newest book is Detox Your Thoughts. I'll have it linked up in the show notes, as well as the LinkedIn learning course that you just recently put out. Where can people find you online?
So you can go to detoxyourthoughts.com or drandreabonior.com, but Detox Your Thoughts is probably easier to spell. I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all the usual suspects. So I look forward to connecting with people there.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.